Welcome.
I'm happy to be
Thank
here.
you for being here from New York City and arriving so well. We're thrilled. Sheri, could you tell us, why did you write this book? What is it that you wanted us to understand about democracy?
So I've been teaching a class for many years on the development of democracy and dictatorship. And once again, people are really wondering about the fate of democracy. Not only in parts of the world where it's relatively new, but even in places where we had taken it for granted for a long time, the United States, Western Europe. And so I wanted to write a book that I hoped would provide my students and others who were interested with a broad historical perspective on how democracies and dictatorships develop. Not only because I think history is important, as a teacher I do think history is important, but also because I think it's very hard for us to understand what's going on today without a historical perspective. So it's hard to know if what's going on today is distinctive or unique or not, or rather if some of the things that we're seeing today are in fact characteristic of the way democracy has developed in the past. Are some of the problems we're facing today problems that, again, we've seen in the past, and so therefore we can learn both more about those problems and how they might be overcome by knowing something about history. And I also wrote the book to give people a sense of, very broadly, how very troubled and how very difficult the backstory of democracy is, and therefore how very fragile it can be. So to give folks a sense of what it takes for democracy to develop and what it takes for democracy to be healthy. Okay?
You spent some time talking about the terms liberal or illiberal and how important they are to modern day democracy. Can you talk to us about what we need to know about that to really understand democracy?
So actually that's a great question, because I think in the United States we tend to conflate liberalism and democracy. We tend to think of them as naturally going together, in fact sort of inexorably intertwined. So democracy is about elections. It's about how countries choose their leaders and governments. Liberalism is actually about something very different. It's about, in some ways, limits on democracy and limits on majorities. It's about saying individual rights, minority rights, these are things actually that democracy can't touch. We call them, in the American tradition, inalienable rights. Things that cannot be taken away from people, even by elections. So liberalism, again, is about individual rights, minority rights, things like freedom of the press, freedom of speech. These are things that are not supposed to actually be subject to democracy. And so if you look back at history, again, as I tried to do in my book, you'll see, for example, that there are many, many more examples of democracies in the past. That is to say, countries that have chosen their leaders and their governments via elections, than countries that had truly liberal democracy. That is to say, combined with those elections, protections for all of those other things. Very, very rare, liberal democracy is. And what we're seeing today, I think, again, easier to see with the benefit of knowing something about history, is that those two things, which we had thought went together and did go together in many places after the Second World War, that liberalism and democracy have begun to separate again. So one of the things that folks talk a lot about today is populism. And one of the things that social scientists and other observers of contemporary politics note is that many populists claim to be Democrats. They have elections. They claim to be speaking for the people. But they are often profoundly illiberal or anti-pluralist. That is to say, they believe in elections, they believe in people's right to choose their leaders, but they don't necessarily agree with or respect a lot of the things that we associate with liberalism. So differentiating these two things is very important, I think, both for understanding what's going on today and also for understanding something about the way, again, democracy has developed in the past. Many more democracies, many fewer liberal democracies. Liberal democracy is a relatively recent and quite rare phenomenon.
Recently, some countries have come into democracy in the 20th century or the early 21st century. Can you kind of talk about a success story or two, or failure or two, countries like that?
So I know we have some students in the room, but not necessarily students. So any of you know anything about European history, what's the first modern example of an attempt at a transition to democracy? Anyone?
France.
France, French Revolution, right? So that's 1789. And when do we finally get something resembling stable democracy in France?
All
right, well, if we put aside some of the troubles today, most people would say with the Fifth Republic, right? So in, sort of 1958. Now, the very fact that it's the Fifth Republic shows you, hey, they tried it before and it didn't work out quite so well. And if you know something about French history, you know that even within those 5 tries, there are many, many more regime changes. So I bring this up because I think it is important to note, and I think this is one of the things that anyone who knows something about European history knows, is that getting to that end point of stable, well-functioning liberal democracy, that is, again, as I've already said, very, very hard. It takes a lot of time for a lot of reasons that we can talk about. So, in fact, if you were to look at countries that we would today maybe call well-functioning democracies, less certain for the United States and Western Europe than we might have said 10 years ago, these are countries that at one time we would have looked at and said, these are not very well-functioning democracies, right? So I've already mentioned France. The other country that we have to think about, perhaps since we're here, is the United States, right? So we think of our country as having always been a democracy and even a liberal democracy. But political scientists actually would question that because, of course, we not only had slavery in this country, right? We all accept that as a great stain on democracy. But up through the 1960s, a significant sector of our population was basically denied both political and civil rights. So for political scientists who look at a country that says, okay, look, you have these rules on the books, but the government is either unwilling or unable to actually enforce political and civil rights for some of its population. At the very least, political scientists would say that is a partial or incomplete democracy. So very few countries make a transition to democracy. 1789 in France, Germany in 1918, Italy in perhaps 1913. And boom, within the space of a few years, they all of a sudden turn into a perfectly well-functioning liberal democracy. That just does not happen. There are just no historical cases of that. So there's lots of countries that have improved the functioning of their democracy over time. The United States would be one of them. France would be another. In fact, almost all would be. But again, it's a long-term process, and it's often a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. So there are some great articles in the paper today. It's the 70th anniversary of actually more or less the refounding of German democracy. Now again, this is always an easy example because Germany is extreme in so many ways. The correct answer to many questions in history is always Hitler, right? So, because Germany is sort of, again, sort of an outlier in many cases. But if you were to look back, in 1945, 47, 49, even the early 50s, and you were to say to someone, maybe you're a betting person, would you like to place bets on how successful Germany will be in constructing a well-functioning liberal democracy? If you bet on that case, I would have said that you were probably overly risky, right? Up through the 1950s, if you surveyed Germans, most people who had lived through the Nazi era still thought the Nazi regime was a good choice that had gone off track. Okay? And now, actually, for all of its flaws, no democracy is ever perfect, Germany is an incredible success story. And if you know something, again, about German history, even if you just have some vague memories that there was this terrible thing called the Second World War and this horrible regime, the National Socialist regime, the fact that actually you can have democracy there really does, I think, go to show that it's not easy. But almost any country can improve. It takes very many special conditions, lots of, again, help, but it can happen. So I think that many countries would graduate from the C to the A category, but you have to be patient and you have to be willing to accept setbacks along the way.
Thanks. What's been the tension between capitalism and democracy historically?
All right, so another tough question, or not another easy question to answer in a few minutes. So capitalism and democracy have gone together. We don't have, there's lots of countries that are capitalist but are not democratic, but we don't have any countries that are democratic and not capitalist. And that tells you something, and the something is probably that one of the great things that capitalism does, potentially, is it separates economic from political power. That's a really good thing for democracy. Too much concentration of power is generally very problematic for democracy. But it can also create tensions, because sometimes capitalism doesn't separate economic from political power. Sometimes capitalism concentrates economic power. Sometimes capitalism doesn't distribute the fruits of growth fairly or equitably. And so in those kinds of situations where you start to see concentrations of power, where you start to see the benefits of growth not distributed fairly or equitably, you tend to see societies that are riven by deep social divisions, class conflicts, polarization, and support for extremism rises. If you believe the system is not working, if you believe the system is rigged against you, then you have much stronger incentive to support radicals who would like to engage in radical changes in that system. So we've seen many times in the past, again, when capitalism has kind of gone off whack. I mean, the sort of most extreme example of this is the Great Depression, but it's not the only one, where capitalism has generated divisions and tendencies that have really tended to weaken, if not actually undermine democracy. So this is something in the contemporary era a lot of people are talking about, again, because of things like rising inequality, declining social mobility, and the sense, again, that the system is not working to benefit everyone fairly. Okay?
The term populism that you mentioned, does it help us understand what's going on in Europe right now?
So it always depends on what you mean by populism. If you mean by populism politicians who are critical of the status quo or critical of the elite, that's part of what democracy is. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's healthy. If you mean by populists what most, I think, political scientists mean, which is politicians and parties who, while claiming to be democratic, are not fully committed to the rules of the game. That is to say, they're not fully committed to playing within democratic institutions. They're not fully committed to playing within democratic norms. They feel like their opponents are not just their opponents who have different policy positions than they do, but are somehow evil or illegitimate and are therefore willing to, again, not allow the game to be played fairly, to demonize people who are different from them, to exploit or deepen divisions in society. This is kind of, again, something outside of the norm, right? So people who are critical of the status quo or critical of elites, we should not label those people populists, because those things are totally normal and healthy. But people, again, who claim that they represent the people and their opponents are, again, illegitimate, evil, something like that, and who therefore believe that their mandate entitles them to go outside of democratic norms or institutions, those people are better placed in the populist category. And those people, those kinds of politicians or parties, can be really, really dangerous for democracy, even if they claim to be Democrats themselves.
What are some of the factors that have sparked populism in the West?
Okay, big questions, good questions. So if you look at sort of commentary on these kinds of things by journalists and other kinds of observers, by academics, you tend to see a few different kinds of arguments come up over and over again. One I've sort of already mentioned, Lynn asked me about, which is the economic explanation. So this explanation has to do with changes in the economy that have deepened inequality, lowered social mobility, started to change the way the industrial and labor markets in our country function, so that some people are doing less well, that some areas are doing less well, that some people feel permanently left behind. And so one explanation is, look, all of these economic changes have made a lot of people feel more insecure, feel, again, like they are being left behind by the way the economy is developed, and worry very much about the future. And so these type of folks are the ones who are willing to vote for populists, because populists, again, promise radical change. That's one kind of explanation. The other kind of of explanation focuses not on economic grievances, but on social and cultural ones. Different kind of explanation. This one says, okay, we've had a combination of dramatic cultural shifts since the 1960s. Incredible questioning of traditional norms about gender, about sexuality, about family, and about religion. And on top of that, we've had, in Europe and in the United States, incredible increases in immigration. This country is a country that's always had waves of immigration, but we are actually now in the United States at a level of foreign-born citizens that actually exceeds even the great periods of immigration in the past, around the turn of the 20th century. So we're at historic highs, and in Europe, many countries that don't have experiences with immigration now have higher numbers of foreign-born citizens than we even have in the US. So a country that I lived in when I graduated from college for a year, I ended up, oddly enough, in Sweden. When I went to Sweden in 1987, I was an outlier. People recognized me clearly as a foreigner. Sweden now has more foreign-born citizens than the United States. 18% of the Swedish population has foreign-born parents or a parent. And these are people who are coming from places like Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. So these are people with very different backgrounds than native-born Swedes. So on top of the cultural change, you have incredible demographic change. And then, of course, in the United States, you have the mobilization of minority groups. And so this argument says, look, all of these social and cultural changes have made a lot of people feel uncomfortable, like the world is changing in ways that they're not sure they fit in anymore. That's threatened their kind of sense of sort of status hierarchies, and populism is a result of this. The other kind of explanation one often hears has to do with technology, changing ways we communicate. Social media has made communication more difficult, has fractured our common narratives, has made it more difficult to police discourse and increased incivility. And this is really one of the main factors behind polarization and the rise of populism. So all of these things clearly are important, right? I think we probably all recognize these as changes that have made people feel uncomfortable in some way, resentful perhaps in some ways, change the ways we relate, the way citizens relate to each other. So these are probably all part of the story, but I think it's very dangerous for us to end there because in a way that takes some of the agency out of democracy. It's the job of politicians, it's the job of political parties, it's the job of democratic governments to respond to people's grievances, to solve problems, to address challenges. And so I think the other question we need to ask about the rise of populism is why have, establishment politicians, establishment parties not done a better job of dealing with these challenges and problems so that people don't feel the need to embrace or vote for politicians and parties who threaten to kind of blow the whole system up. And so another part of this equation, I think, is to look at really what's happened with, again, establishment parties and politicians, both in the United States and in Europe over the past decades. We actually talk about this in the US, although often not in a holistic way. So there's lots of conversations about, voter suppression, gerrymandering, money in politics, the role played by private interests in funding campaigns, in shaping the political agenda. And all of these things, again, feed into creating, I think, over the past decades, politicians and parties that are not as close to the people, not as responsive to them. They oftentimes don't even know what it is that people actually want. So there was some great research actually done by a colleague of mine at Columbia. It was in a New York Times, reported in a New York Times op-ed several months ago. And they did this wonderful research. They went to congressional staffers, the people who filter information for representatives and senators, and who tell them, okay, look, these are the kinds of things you should be focused on, these are the kinds of issues that matter. And it polled them and it said, okay, look, here are some issues. Tell me what your constituents think about this. So not in general, but about their own constituents. Again, the folks who the senators or the Congress people represent. Their views, their guesses about what their own constituents want were dramatically off. dramatically off. They had very little idea of what their people in their own districts, however constructed, actually wanted, because they weren't hearing from the people. They were hearing primarily from special interest groups of all different kinds of types. So they didn't even know what their own voters and constituents wanted, and so it's very difficult to imagine that they were therefore voting on the basis of any kind of reflection, however even tenuous, of what their actual voters wanted, right? So probably we all think to ourselves, look, you know, the average person is somewhat more moderate than our parties. You know, we actually have some kind of consensus on a whole variety of issues, but somehow or another it never gets through. I think you can have a similar conversation about things that have happened in Europe. And so the other part of the equation I think we need to think about with populism is how do we make our institutions more reflective of, more responsive to the concerns of voters and constituents. And I think that a lot of what's going on with, again, the embrace of more radical alternatives has to do with that part of the equation as well. So not just changes in society, economy, and technology, but also ways in which our political institutions, so to speak, have gotten somewhat more out of touch with the people at the same time as the need for them to be responsive has risen.
There's an article you wrote entitled "Populism is Not Fascism," and you talk about the use of the term fascism. How should we think about and use this word?
So as someone who spent a lot of time writing about researching the interwar period, I'm very wary of throwing around the term fascism because I know what it means and what kind of movement and what kind of politics it represented. As far as history is concerned, fascism is a very particular type of political phenomenon. Fascists were not liberals, but they were not Democrats either. They embraced violence, not just as a means, but as an end. And they were very interested in kind of revolutionizing everything. They didn't want to fix democracy. They didn't want to make it more responsive. They didn't really want to represent the majority or the people in any real sense. These were movements that were violent, they were revolutionary, they were anti-liberal, they were anti-democratic. Populists can be very dangerous for democracy, as I think I've said, but they are not fascists. They are not fascists. Most of them claim not to be anti-democratic, even if they are, as I said, often anti-liberal. And although we talk about violence in our society, we have thus far yet, hopefully we never will, in either the United States or Western Europe, seen politicians that openly embrace violence, again, as either a means of politics or an end in and of itself. So I think calling populists fascists is not only historically inaccurate, but I think it's quite dangerous, because when you start seeing your opponents as really dangerous, as evil, then you are willing to also embrace tactics. In fact, sometimes you need to embrace tactics that I think in other kinds of contexts are totally counterproductive. So I think by calling people fascists when they're not, we're not only misrepresenting what's going on, but we're pushing people to misunderstand what the correct response to, again, politicians and parties who you dramatically disagree with, what kinds of responses are appropriate or necessary. So I don't think we should throw this term around. I think it's inaccurate, and I think it's really counterproductive.
How do we make comparisons between now and the challenges in democracy in the past, like in the 1930s and the 1960s?
So again, the 1930s, the interwar period, this was a much more difficult period than we're facing today. So we face real challenges today. Again, lots of economic change, lots of social change, lots of cultural change, lots of technological change. So I think we all recognize that this is a period that we're going through when societies, economies, they really are changing in pretty dramatic ways. But if you look back at the interwar period, again, I'm guessing in this room there's a lot of folks who are history buffs who know a lot about history. This was a totally different level of challenge. I mean, the kinds of things that happened economically during the interwar period, great inflation. I'm sure we all remember pictures of people pushing around wheelbarrows of money. Great Depression, I mean 25% unemployment, unbelievable declines in sort of the economy, incredible periods of social polarization and division. Challenges back then, problems back then, much much more difficult. And also, most of the regimes at that time in Europe that were democratic were quite young and weak, and so therefore even less capable than the regimes we have today of dealing with those challenges. So I think the 1930s should stand out to us as a warning, but I don't think we should immediately worry that we are in quite that bad of a position today. The 1960s, if I have another
Sure.
slide. The 1960s, on the other hand, I actually think are a more interesting comparison, because what we had back then also was obviously significant discontent with what was going on in our societies. Significant discontent with the way democracy was functioning. So massive protests in the United States and Europe, even violence, right? So terrorism in Europe, domestic terrorism in Europe, from both the left and the right, obviously shootings in the United States, both by the authorities and sort of violent subgroups. But we managed to survive that. Democracy managed to adjust. Not perfectly, but enough so that a lot of that discontent dissipated. And we actually went through an incredible period of reform starting in the late 1960s and 70s. One of them I already mentioned, obviously perhaps the most important was the civil rights movement, the enfranchisement finally of, full enfranchisement of African Americans legally and politically. So democracy managed to adjust to that discontent and to that resentment and frustration. And so what we'd like to think, right, is that that's how we're going to look back on what's going on today. Lots of frustration, lots of resentment, lots of people feeling like the system's not working, but democracy manages to recalibrate in such a way as to dissipate much of that frustration and resentment.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll turn it over to Saul for questions from the audience. Could you talk to us about what's going on in Italy at this point, where two opposite populist movements have come together to form a common populist party? How does that work?
So Italy has always been sort of a little bit of a mess. It works, but just barely. So Italy is kind of a sort of potentially, in any case, you know, a harbinger of what can happen if problems are not solved. So what you have now, as you said, is a government that's made up of populists ostensibly of the right, the League, and sort of the left, the Five-Star Movement. But you have to recognize that the party system in Italy basically blew itself up over a decade ago. So what you're seeing now is the result of a party system and a political system more generally that basically exploded over 10 years ago, from corruption, from mismanagement. And so what you're seeing now, again, populists in Italy now are sort of the fruits of much longer term structural problems, of a democracy that simply was not working. And so, again, Italy should be a warning of what can happen if democracies become too far out of kilter. Because you can only have the government you have in Italy now, again, if the traditional parties, the establishment, had not disappeared beforehand. And so, you know, one should look at Italy and be quite concerned that this might be the future of other European countries if establishment politicians don't do a better job of figuring out how to solve the challenges their societies face.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Saul, and before Saul will do that, David, can you come up here? I need help getting down.
Surely.
It's too high. Thanks. Thank you.
Lots of questions. We don't get to all of them. During the book signing, you might be able to walk up and add to it, and I'll bet if you buy the book, you'll get answers to some of your questions. All right, between democracy and dictatorships, which one is historically more efficient?
Well, I'm gonna vote for democracy every time, but that's not just a normative. I actually think that that is a sort of empirical argument as well. So there's a lot of debate, for instance, about efficiency with regards to economics, right? So which type of regime is better able to promote economic growth? And in fact, the data on that is a little bit all over the place, although again, a slight edge goes to democracies over the long term for better promoting growth. But I'm going to think of efficiency as something broader than that, as again, the ability to solve society's challenges. And I think in that sense, democracy wins hands down. if only because, again, to sort of paraphrase Winston Churchill, it has the great advantage of sort of being able to correct its mistakes, which dictatorships don't, right? If we don't like what our governments and our leaders are doing, we have the opportunity to vote for other ones. But democracies also have more built-in incentives not to facilitate corruption, to be more responsive to the people. These are not things that democracies always are, right? We can speak of a lot of corrupt, unresponsive democracies. We were just talking about Italy. But dictatorships have even less incentive to be that way because by definition they're protecting the interests of an elite and they don't have to be, at least over the short and medium term, responsive to their people. So I vote for democracy, and I think empirically that is correct, but this is a question of the long term. There's lots of problems with democracy at particular points in time, but over the long term, societies do much better under democratic regimes than they do under dictatorships.
Well, what do you think of Steve Bannon, former advisor to President Trump, his activities in Europe on behalf of populism?
Yeah. So Bannon, after being sort of unceremoniously kicked out of power in the United States, has decided to go to Europe and try to sort of, mix things up there, where he's gotten, for reasons that I cannot quite explain, a much warmer reception than one would think, given, again, how little power he now has in the United States. I mean, basically what he's trying to do is link together people, populists, nationalists in particular in Europe, who have views that correspond to his. Now these are people who are struggling, populists are sort of struggling to gain further inroads into European political systems, and so for right now they're perfectly happy to kind of claim fellowship with populists in other countries, to sort of claim fellowship with Steve Bannon, with Trump, yada, yada, yada. Over the long term, my guess is that the fact that most of these folks see things in sort of a zero-sum kind of way, they view politics in kind of zero-sum kind of manner, that they're nationalists, is going to mean that the limits of their cooperation will probably be reached fairly quickly. They're perfectly happy to claim, that they support each other, but what kinds of actual tangible cooperation they'll be able to engage in, other than, for instance, joint lists at the upcoming European elections, I'm not so sure.
Two U.S.-focused questions. What can we do to enhance liberal democracy in the United States? And is the potential of whites becoming a minority in the U.S. fueling populism here, and if so, how much?
Great. Okay, so the first question I think gets back to some of the things that Lynn and I just sort of talked about, which is, I think fixing our democracy, restoring people's faith in liberal democracy as the best system, as the most efficient system, means basically doing two things. One is, first, I really think it requires fixing our institutions, figuring out ways to eliminate corruption, to make them more responsive, to make people feel like their politicians and their parties are really there for them, as opposed to, again, special interests or elites or things like that. There's lots of things that we can do to fix that kind of thing. And hopefully that will contribute to the other half of the equation, which is dealing with some of the real challenges our societies face. Inequality and social mobility are bad things. They're bad things not only from an economic perspective, but they're bad things from the political perspective. They make people feel like the system is not working for them. We have to deal with social divisions in this country. We have to deal with the fact that there are a lot of people who feel concerned about what's going on, minorities who feel like historic injustices have not been addressed. We need people who can speak to these things and come up with policies to address them in ways that don't make some citizens feel enfranchised, unprivileged, things like that. And we clearly need to deal with technology, which is a great thing, right? Things are getting better from a technological perspective. I can't live without my phone anymore, even though I yell at my kids for looking at theirs all the time. But we also have to recognize that changing technology, just as in the past, can create real problems. In a way, we're dealing with a situation for historians in this room that you're probably familiar with also, again, from the turn of the century. Lots of new technologies, and they got away from government because the market changes faster than governments do. But eventually, governments stepped in to regulate in ways that, while not perfect, did at least address some of the most egregious problems. So we need to both again, I think fix our institutions and hope that that contributes to government being able to solve some of the problems that have made citizens feel so, again, worried about the future. As far as the second question concerned, look, there's simply no doubt that power transitions are very difficult politically, right? This was a country for a long time dominated by white Anglo-Saxons, and that period is coming to an end. There is simply no reason why that has to be problematic, but it is a transition that needs to be dealt with. That is to say, minority groups need to feel that historic wrongs have been recognized and dealt with, but not in a way that makes people feel threatened by changing demographics. Diverse societies are difficult, right? Lots of different people with lots of different opinions from lots of different backgrounds. That's much harder to deal with than a society where people are pretty much all the same. Fewer differences, easier to reach agreement, easier for everybody to feel like they're in the same boat. Diversity requires harder work, right? But it's also what makes our society so vibrant and so dynamic and so special. But recognizing the challenges is the first step to dealing with them. And I think that one of the things, hopefully, that this current period has done is it's made us as a society realize that we do face certain challenges. That a lot of things that we had chosen not to confront forthrightly, we can't not confront forthrightly anymore. Hopefully, recognizing this problem will give us the first step in going forward. But it has to be done in such a way, again, as to make everyone feel like they're part of the solution and not just part of the problem.
Why does liberal democracy seem to prosper, I think this question is in the northern hemisphere more so than in the southern hemisphere, or at least parts of each? How do we see liberal democracy so much, I presume, not looking at China, but perhaps even including India, but certainly in Europe, than we do somewhere south in the southern hemisphere?
So I would slightly rephrase that question, if I may. I don't know who asked it. Which is, I would say that the right way to think about this is because democracy is such a long, hard slog, because it takes so long to get all of those pieces of the puzzle in place, countries that started on this process earlier tend to be much more successful at it. So first modern transitions to democracy the first modern transitions to democracy happen in Europe, and again, if you want to think about it this way, in the United States and Canada. So these are countries that started figuring out how to make democracy work a few hundred years ago, and so they now are further along than some other countries. But not all of them. Again, democracy first comes to much of Europe in the interwar period, and so a lot of what you're seeing, I think, in what perhaps or the questioner was thinking of as the global south, are countries that are first starting on their path to democracy. So a lot of countries that today we look at and say, oh, these are kind of weak democracies or poorly functioning democracies, I would look at them not so much as countries in the south, so to speak, but as countries that are just starting on this path, on this struggle, and I would expect that, again, over time, each attempt will hopefully become a little bit better, as was the case in places like France, in Germany, even Italy, better today than it was in the past, Spain, Portugal, all of these countries, right, which have gotten very gradually and not necessarily linearly better over time.
Very specifically, what is happening in Hungary today? Is it less democratic than before?
Well, it's certainly less democratic than it was, let's say, in the 1990s. It's a heck of a lot more democratic than it's ever been before. So if you know something about Hungary, it first got its independence in 1918, obviously with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All the countries, the decolonized countries in Europe after 1918, all started off as democracies. The only one that exited the interwar period as such, sort of, was Czechoslovakia. So Hungary actually was the first to collapse. For those history trivia buffs, it gave us the only communist regime outside of the Soviet space in the interwar period, right? So you get a brief communist interlude in Hungary by 1919, and then rapidly followed by a sort of collapse into dictatorship. So as bad as Hungary is, it's a heck of a lot better than the last time it tried. What we have in Hungary now is not really a democracy in any sense of the word. There are elections, they're not really free and fair, and we don't really have any of the other trappings of liberal democracy. So Hungary is not democratic. It's definitely less democratic than it was in the 1990s, but given Hungary's history, I would say this is something we should be sorry about, but not completely surprised by.
Dr. Berman is on a very tight schedule, so we'll take one more question here, and then we'll be over here for some book purchase and book signings if you are interested. And certainly, if I didn't get to your question, please raise it then. So, this final softball question. We'll see whether you are planning to run for office or not. How should we rate, President Trump in these various categories? Is he really a danger to our system?
Well, I like to avoid partisan things. I would say, as a scholar of democracy, what worries me most about the Trump administration is not its policies, which, whether I agree with or not, are completely irrelevant. Different policies, different viewpoints, that's part of democracy. What worries me about Trump as a Democrat with a small d, right, is his willingness to go beyond the norms and institutions of democracy. His seeming lack of regard for things like the separation of powers, for freedom of the press, for not delegitimizing his opponents, for not recognizing that, being president does not mean that the other branches of government don't have power over you. These kinds of things, as a small d Democrat, I think we should all be concerned about. Again, has nothing to do with his particular policies, which, whether you agree with or not, is everybody's right, but that's not problematic for democracy. What's problematic for democracy is when someone is not willing to play by the rules of the game, when someone does not take opposition as legitimate, and when someone tries to weaken the checks and balances that make democratic societies function, and who seems to revel in polarization rather than trying to overcome it. Those are not good things, again, from a small d perspective. And so that's what worries me most, again, as a sort of someone who cares about democracy generally.
Thank you very much.